Good morning and welcome to Shattering Myths, the program devoted to those of you who have come to realize that all of the world's religious, political, economic, and military institutions are corrupt and counterproductive. I am Yahowah. Our number, if you'd like to join us over the next 2 hours, is 877-300-7645. I'd like to pick up where we left off in our first hour yesterday. We were talking about the United Nations turf war, which was among the most revealing discussions of the past decade, and it's one that America isn't even talking about. You know, America is fixated on the bat heard round the world from last night's Seahawks-Detroit Lions game, and doesn't seem to care that in the United Nations, the United States was summarily rebuffed. We had no allies. We were exposed and condemned by not only Russia, but by China, by Iran, by Cuba, and just in the week or the few days prior to that, by the Pope. No matter where you turned, the United States was seen as the world's most menacing country, as a country who has invaded nation after nation as if the whole world belonged to it, and consistently made bad situations worse. And yet, none of the truth of that resonated. Putin even asked, "Are you aware of what you've done? To even know what you've done." Speaking of the disaster that America has created in Afghanistan, not once but twice. In Iraq, not once but 3 times. In Syria, in Libya, in Egypt, in Yemen. Are you even aware of the mess that you've made, of this vast migration into Europe of displaced civilians because you decided to invade Afghanistan and Iraq and then bomb Syria? That after displacing the dictators Mullah Omar in Afghanistan, where there was virtually no terrorism, horrible dictator to be sure, but Afghanistan is worse in every possible way than it was under Mullah Omar. Or Saddam Hussein, you decided that we were going to go and oust him, and Iraq is infinitely, immeasurably worse off than it was before we invaded on a pile of lies. And look at Libya. Look at Egypt. And God, look at Syria. There was no Muslim refugee problem before we invaded, before we stupidly lashed out and did the wrong thing for the wrong reason. And what's so amazing about it is after having failed in Afghanistan, we failed in Iraq, and after having failed in Iraq, we failed in Libya, and after failing in Libya, we failed in Syria, and after failing in Syria, we failed for exactly the same reason in Yemen. And all the while we're failing in Egypt, and we don't seem to have a clue. There's no one in America that's willing to be accountable for our malfeasance, for our utter stupidity, for our complete lack of good judgment and morality. And rather than accept the truth that the world has been maligned, has been ravaged by America's military and diplomatic stupidity over the past 2 or 3 decades, the Abominator created a mythical world and pretended like America was the peacemaker and the rest of the world was the aggressor, when the opposite is true. And Americans at large yawned. Didn't give a damn. Clueless. The Abominator was particularly contemptuous of Putin. mocking Putin. He said the Ukrainians wanted to align themselves with Europe, not Moscow. That's not true there, pal. When given the whole country given the opportunity to vote, they voted for a Ruski, for a man that was very much aligned with Moscow. It's only the thugs in the area around Kiev that overthrew, with American support, the popularly elected government that wanted to align themselves with the West, but only because they thought they could scam money out of the West more easily than they were scamming money out of Russia. And it was all an economic scam. It's the fifth time the Ukrainians, in the 20-year failed experiment with independence, have been back to the well, the trough, the money trough. And you're not smart enough to see it, that you caused those riots, that you inspired those riots, that you aided and abetted the thugs who overturned democracy there, and that you're not smart enough, Obamanator, to know that 97% of those in Crimea said, hell no, we don't want to be associated with those thugs, and voted to be associated with Russia. Their vote doesn't count. You just don't like it? How about in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions in the east, where they voted over 95% in favor of disassociating themselves from the thugs you inspired, and voted to be part of Russia? You couldn't have that, could you, Obamanator? So you started to blame Russia for the very things that you were doing. You armed, you equipped, you provided military intelligence to, you engaged NATO on behalf of the Ukraine, and then blamed Russia for aiding and abetting those who had been their citizens just 20 years ago. So their votes to secede from the Soviet Union counts, but their votes to rejoin the Russian Federation don't. It's a pretty hypocritical world that the Obamanator lives in. And what's amazing about the Putin-Obama conflict is that there isn't one American among 20 that sees through the fog of political rhetoric, that recognizes that in the case of Syria and in the case of the Ukraine, the United States is dead wrong, counterproductive, dishonest, responsible for the mayhem. And Russia is a vastly more upstanding, civil, and honest broker. That's astonishing. And America sees exactly the other way, because the media is in lockstep with the Obamanator in all of this. And yet the world recognizes it. And at the World Tribunal of the United Nations, nation after nation exposed and condemned the United States and its meddling in the world and the utter failure of American military and foreign policy. But yet the Obamanator said the Ukrainians wanted to align with Europe, which is not true. And that Moscow, not Moscow, again not true. And pointed out that sanctions had led to a fallen ruble and the immigration of more educated Russians. Here, the sanctions against Russia hurt Europe, hurt Russia, hurt the United States. That's what sanctions do. But what those sanctions did, Mr. Obama, is compel Russia to ink the largest trade deal ever between nations, between Russia and Iran. It led to Iran and Russia being inseparable allies. It caused exactly the opposite that you intended. And then it put Russia in a no-lose situation with regard to the Ukraine. If you're going to be hammered for not doing something, you might as well do it. If you're going to be penalized for a penalty for a crime you did not commit, then you might as well commit the crime. That was the Russian view in the Ukraine. Everything the Abominator did backfired. And now here in Syria, the Russians have engaged, I think foolishly, by the way, in the sense that there is no way to prevail if you engage conventional troops in an Islamic war between Sunni and Shia Muslims. There is no prevailing. There are no good guys. But the Russians at least realize that America was stupid in ousting Saddam Hussein, stupid in ousting Mullah Omar, stupid in ousting Gaddafi, stupid in bombing Yemen, stupid in going against Musharraf, stupid in opposing Mubarak. And that these dictators that were more, with exception of Mullah Omar, more secular than they were religious, did a better job of controlling their population than the governments they were replaced with. And therefore, in a war ostensibly to fight terror, we increased terror immeasurably in all of these countries. And yet we're continuing that same path. And here we are telling the world that Assad has to go. Did we learn nothing from Gaddafi has to go? Did we learn nothing from Saddam Hussein has to go? Did we learn nothing from the Taliban has to go? Has America's educational institutions become so polluted with political correctness that it's rendered a generation or two of Americans now, maybe three, totally incapable of rational thought? Is that where we've fallen? Because there's no other explanation for America being on the wrong side consistently making bad situations worse. But that's where we find ourselves. And that is what the world said. Then the Abominator said, history is littered with the failure of false prophets. And this is a man that most of what he says is untrue. And the vast preponderance of what he says is untrue, and he presents himself as if he were a prophet, and therefore the man speaking the words is the false prophet. And the fallen empire that he spoke about, look in the mirror, America. So the false prophet, the man who lies about most everything he says that history is littered with the failure of false prophets and fallen empires. America is on the verge of collapse. There is no saving America. It is not only catastrophically in debt, its economy and incentives are hopelessly crippled. And now you have a candidate, Bernie Sanders, that is running as an avowed socialist, but he's a communist, who is running on class welfare, that the solution is to take ever more from those who are productive. They'll have almost no incentive now. I know America's business and corporate tax rates are amongst the highest in the world. And the burdens placed on business by government in terms of being their tax collection agency, their health care provider, and all manner of other burdens in terms of employment restrictions, is such that it's becoming nigh on impossible to make anything in America. So all we really have is a service economy. And so now what? But beyond all of that, there's some 70 trillion of credit debt. America stopped being productive and income stopped growing. So to create the illusion that we still had a viable economy, back in the 60s and early 70s, we created this thing called credit. And now the vast preponderance of the U.S. economy doesn't run on cash. It runs on credit. And there just is no hope of keeping that system afloat. So it doesn't really matter if it's because of the stupidity of us continuing to make bad situations worse with our military and failing miserably while funding the largest military in the history of the world. It doesn't matter if it's that nations after nation, now 3 very large nations plus one that could well be considered the world's largest nation, and the Roman Catholic Church, and the way the Vatican sets itself up as a nation state, all openly exposing and condemning the United States as a bankrupt nation, as a moral failure, as a source of violence in the world. The country is doomed. And we did it to ourselves mainly through the incorporation of political correctness into the political scene and in the media, and worst of all, in academia, where we have indoctrinated generations now to view being judgmental as the ultimate offense, as incapable of distinguishing between right and wrong, good and bad. That's the problem we find ourselves in. There is no cure for these problems. So you want to find a falling empire? The United States. And then he says, who believe that might always makes right. And yet, isn't that the U.S. mantra? Not is our military and spy apparati larger than the rest of the world combined. We use it more often and in more places than the rest of the world combined. The thing that is the surest sign that a person or a nation is lost is when they accuse their foes of what they themselves are guilty of. When you talk about others being false prophets when you are the false prophet, when you talk about others having fallen empires when your empire is falling, when you speak of believing that might always makes right, and you are the mightiest superpower in the world, the most prone to use it. And you have tried to tar and feather your opponents with your own faults. I received another number of scathing letters from the fellow that called in and wanted to say that's not what the Torah says, when it's exactly what the Torah says, by any established definition of Yahowah's vocabulary as it relates to the timing of his Moed Mikra, and that he wanted to disprove the Torah with 2 apocryphal books, Jubilees and Enoch, which would, of course, make God a liar, since he said that the Torah was complete and lacking nothing, that it shouldn't be added to. But in his scathing indictments of me, he presented his own faults. Now, it doesn't say that I'm perfect. Putin's not perfect. But when your criticism of another represents what you yourself are guilty of, that's when hypocrisy has rendered you incapable of being reasonable. So Obama, after pretending that he wasn't the false prophet that Putin was, that he wasn't leading the fallen empire that Putin was, that he wasn't the one who believed that might always makes right when it's the United States that is intervening around the world with its military, then that he says you can count on that. Those who counted on any of Barack Obama's promises were screwed. You were stupid to count on him. But you've had now 6 years and you've gotten nothing. But Obama also acknowledged that he is open to a realistic approach that could see him work with Russia and fight, and Iran, to fight the Islamic State, and a managed transition away from Assad. That sounds like he's open to delusion. How can you have a managed transition away from Assad if you're going to partner with 2 countries that are devoted to maintaining Assad? It's absolutely delusional. And moreover, there isn't anybody in politics, anybody in the media, that is stating the obvious, that our undermining of Assad, just like our undermining of Saddam Hussein, just like our undermining of Muammar Gaddafi, is what has caused this cancer to spread. You see, we are so naive about Islam as a nation that we think that Islam is an Abrahamic religion and that they are peace-loving and that the majority of Muslims are moderates and that it's only those radicals that have misinterpreted their religion, the extremists that really have nothing to do with their religion, that are perpetrating the terrorist acts. We've been indoctrinated with political correctness to believe lies. And so we're unable to see this connection, and unable to see the connection. Everything we do is wrong. We don't understand that when you have a religion that is predicated on killing, on stealing, on lying, on rape, predicated on these things, actually built through the slave trade and the abuse of others, that when you have a religion this caustic, this destructive, that it requires a dictator to keep it under control, to keep Muslims under control. And the moment you release the control mechanism, as we did with Saddam Hussein, things go from bad to infinitely worse. The control mechanism that was placed by Mullah Omar, things went from bad to infinitely worse in Afghanistan, which is why the second most refugees are coming from Afghanistan, some 4 million of them. It's why Libya has become a terrorist hellhole after removing the only control mechanism that was in place, the dictatorship of Muammar Gaddafi. Muslims cannot live peaceably. They can't keep from the urge to kill one another without a dictator. It's a statement of fact. It has been that way since Muhammad created the religion. And yet we continue to make these same mistakes. And this idea that a managed transition away from Assad is going to produce a different result than a transition did away from Saddam Hussein, or that a transition did away from Mubarak, that a transition did away from Muammar Gaddafi. What did the transitions away from those dictators produce? Anarchy. Infinitely more terrorism, as it will away from Assad. Assad's a bad guy. But those who would replace him are far worse. Florida Senator Marco Rubio, who is making foreign policy the centerpiece of his run for the Republican presidential nomination, warned that Putin was making a case that American leadership had failed in the Middle East and Obama was to blame. Well, the first part of that is true. American interventionism in the Islamic world has universally failed. Universally failed. It has failed as it relates to the West Bank, Gaza, Egypt, Libya, the Sudan, Somalia, Nigeria, the Central African Republic, Syria, Turkey, Iraq, Iran, Yemen, Pakistan. Our involvement has universally failed. And while Obama is to blame, so is George W. Bush. So is Jimmy Carter. So is Bill Clinton. So is the U.S. military. So is the U.S. CIA. They're all to blame, as was King George I. He said the president has fallen into that. He, in fact, strengthened Putin's hands. No, he didn't strengthen Putin's hands. He put the world at the precipice of world wars, what Obama did. This infighting now in Syria, where you have Russian troops and Russian aircraft and American aircraft and Russian ships and American ships, has put the world right at the edge of world war. Twice in the last 2 days, Russian warplanes, for a matter of either seconds or minutes, have skirted the Turkish border, and the Turks ever the stupid ones, launched fighter aircraft as if the Russians had the intent to bomb Turkey, to create an escalation. Why? Because the Turks want more American military hardware. The Turks are part of NATO, and therefore they wanted to escalate this war cold to hot so that NATO has a reason to exist against Russia. And therefore, Erdogan said yesterday that an attack on one NATO nation is attack on all, as if the Russians intended to attack Turkey. But just think how a single event like that, because of the malfeasance, the inability to think things through, to make connections, to see the big picture, to know cause and consequence, which is the thing that fails most Americans, that we put ourselves in the world at the precipice of world war. And this is not a war with the Islamic State. The Islamic State has no interest in the United States. Doesn't want to establish itself in the United States. Could care less about it. If the United States wasn't bombing them, they would pay no attention to the United States. I don't even think that the Islamic State gives two hoots about Assad. The Islamic State's focus is singular. Protect Sunni Muslims against Shia Muslims. That's their purpose. And this war that's about to be unleashed on the world is not one that the United States can defend its citizens against. It is a war which we will lose. All parties will lose. We have Robert on the line, having called in from Torrance, California. I was once a neighbor in Torrance, lived in Redondo Beach and Palos Verdes, places I'm sure you're aware of. Robert, how are you today?
Very much so.
Yeah.
Fine.
Yeah, I went to the University of Spoiled Children downtown Los Angeles, and one of my fraternity brothers and I rented a condo right along the beach in Redondo Beach after we left, and then I moved shortly thereafter to Rancho Palos Verdes and then to Palos Verdes Peninsula. Love that part of the country.
Yeah, in fact, last time we spoke, they were just starting an exhibit of Dead Sea Scrolls at the California Science Museum.
Oh, okay. Wow. Outstanding. I wish more people would read them and pay attention to what's in them. You know, the only challenge I have with the Dead Sea Scrolls, and since you brought it up, that's not the reason you called, I don't think, but the Essenes, who were the religious sect that was there, the Essenes were no better than the Pharisees. They were a religious sect. Most of what the Essenes wrote and copied were religious texts. The majority of what they left behind only reveals the nature of their misguided religion. And so it is important to recognize that while the Dead Sea Scrolls have tremendous value because they provide over a 1,000-year, almost 1,200-year earlier witness to the text, and a witness to the text copied in Yisrael as opposed to copied in Babylon. It doesn't mean that everything that the Essenes wrote about was divinely inspired. But go ahead. You had a question about Yahowah?
And answering his invitations.
Yes.
Yeah, I just got back from a vacation in the Bahamas in which I built cover
nice timing
for him through all 8 days of I'm going to get you sucker.
Wow. Wow, were you on land, or how far were you from, because that storm hunkered down for almost 5 days, that it was just in the Bahamas on both Long Key, Cat Key, and that area. Were you close to that area?
It was in the Atlantis Resorts.
Oh, okay. Nassau area. Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's an amazing resort there. I've been there a couple of times, but that walk-through aquarium and their water slides and the like, That's a pretty amazing place. I'm not a gambler. I don't have any issue with gambling. I'm just not a gambler. But I do think that is a pretty mind-bending resort there.
Same here. And I also noticed that I wasn't the only one there for a sukkah.
Yeah.
Sukkah elevator there.
Yeah, oh yeah, amazing. My favorite part of the Bahamas, though, is really to charter a boat with friends with toys on it, so that you can go to the outlying islands where you get a mile of perfect white sand beach for wave running and for water skiing and for just sunbathing and scuba diving. What a place! I mean, it's the most perfect water I think anywhere in the world. And approachable, easy to get to. Well, we'll be back. We'll listen to your question on Yahowah, Robert. And I'll stop yapping about the Bahamas. But when you mention it, one of my favorite places. I look forward to being there soon. All right, we have Robert having just come back from the Bahamas, which in my view is the closest place that there is to what I would call a tropical paradise, a beautiful place, but in the midst of a storm. You know what the name of the storm, Joaquin, means? It's based upon Yahowah, which means Yahweh lifts up. So we actually had the storm named after Yahowah. I don't think many people know that, but that's indeed what Joaquin means. Anyway, you had a question on Yahowah? Or a statement?
Answering his invitation. I noticed that for what it says in the Torah, it says closely observe and read to approach the Spirit or to approach Yahowah on these days. We have to actually have a Torah to read, or is the Torah study we do here on the program good enough to answer the invitation, or verbal or mental? Hi, Yahowah, here I am, answering your invitation to the 8th day of Sukkah.
You know what? There's a lot of things that are not specifically answered. And I think if Yahowah said, this is specifically what you have to do. This is how I want you to show up. This is where I want you to stand. This is what I want you to say. This is what I want you to think. This is where I want you to do it. And I want you to face in this direction as you stand this way and make this declaration. Then what he's doing is taking the individual judgment and thought process out of it. The very fact that you're asking these questions and doing so really in a lighthearted way tells you that he has communicated his desired intent. And so when somebody, for example, takes the position that you can be absolute certain what days they are, I mean, I can tell you within one day or within 24 hours on any one of these, but that they can say absolutely what day they are. They're turning something that was designed to get us to think into just an uninformed reaction. So I would much prefer that you work through that answer, and I can tell you my thoughts, but I think everything has been presented as instruction, as teaching, as guidance to instruct you, to guide you, so that once you have this information, and you have the information, you can make your own conclusion. And by the way, yeah, I think your answer is what he's looking for.
I kind of think so too.
Yeah.
Some response.
Some response. Right, a thoughtful response. And I think that's all he's looking for is a thoughtful response. That you've taken the time to listen to what he had to say. He wants to be prioritized. You've come to know him. You've come to understand what he's offering. You know that he's issued the invitation, and you want to accept the invitation. All you're looking for at this point is wondering, what are the best ways for me to accept that invitation? Is it to listen to a program that's devoted to sharing the Torah? Is it to actually read a copy of the Torah? Should I translate it on my own? Should I read a translation of it? How much should I read of it? That's what God intended, is for you to be asking yourself those questions. And I don't think there is a right or wrong answer. How about that?
Sounds good to me.
Yeah, but I think that there was a definitive right answer and a definitive wrong answer of listening versus reading, of reading quietly or reciting out loud, of exactly when you had to appear and how, and the whole matter. I think God would have specified it, but I think He didn't specify it because there is no right or wrong answer. I had a person write me the other day, Robert, that was talking about the fact that either they or a dear friend, I think it was them, has terminal cancer, and wanted to know if there's an express way to become part of the covenant, knowing that they're not going to live through the series of 7 Moed Mikre over the next year. And my response to them, and I'm not empowered to speak for God, but my response is that if so long as you know who Yahweh is, you've made a diligent effort to listen to Him, and you've accepted the terms and conditions of the covenant, I suspect that you can meet with Him and benefit from those 7 Moed Mikre at any time. We know that Hezekiah asked for a different time, and Yahweh granted it. So based on that, I'm certain that He'll do the same for any of us.